The following product was received free of charge for the purpose of review. Thanks to Elegoo for providing this, allowing me to take a look at it. I've not been paid to make this review though, so all opinions expressed remain my own. I don't know about you, but 3D printing has always been something that fascinated me, ever since the first time I saw it about 10 years ago. It amazed me that you could design something on a computer and then only a few hours later have the physical version in your hand. So join me in this video as I take a look at the Mars 2 Pro resin printer from Elegoo. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and today is something of an interesting video featuring a product that could be incredibly relevant to us as scale modelers. First up though, let's get into the box and see what we have. Starting at the beginning, a small instruction booklet which gives you a list of things that should be included, as well as a guide on how to get your printer up and running to get your first prints. There are some spare plastic films which go on the bottom of the resin tank and are replaceable. We've got a bag of Allen keys and spare screws, this extra plastic mount which you'll see in use later, a UK power cord, an AC adapter, a handy pair of snips, a plastic scraper, a metal scraper, some face masks, a rubber seal, some rubber gloves, and a 4GB memory stick. There are also some paper funnels with a fine mesh filter at the bottom, which will be super handy at putting the resin back in the bottle at the end. Here is the printing plate. It's not massive, but then most models I build aren't too big anyway. Oh, and then there is the printer itself. It's not a particularly large machine and easily fits on a desktop. Finally, a red plastic cover. The rubber seal we saw earlier goes around the bottom of this to give a good fit on the machine. Cool, so with all of that out of the way, let's see if I can set it up and get it working. I peeled off the protective plastic on the screen, turned on the printer and manually raised the mount for the printing plate. There are buttons on the screen for this. The printing plate is then slotted onto the mount and tightened using the screw at the top. In the initial setup I had to loosen these two screws to allow the plate to be freed to move. The resin vat is removed by loosening the screws on the sides, and then the protective film on the LCD screen was peeled away. I placed an A4 piece of paper here and then pressed the correct buttons to start the zeroing process for the build plate. This makes sure that it is in the correct place to get those prints right. I retightened the two screws and then checked to see if the paper could be removed. I lifted the build plate up just a touch so that I could remove the paper, and this is the build plate correctly zeroed. The resin vat was then replaced and tightened up with the screws on the side, and I then pressed the buttons to check the UV screen was working. So, with the printer now ready to go, I'm going to need some resin. Elegoo have sent me some of this water washable resin in ceramic grey. It comes with this little brush in the box, which I presume is to help you clean the prints with later. I've never worked with this stuff before, and as you can see there are some safety warnings, so face masks and gloves are a must when using this. That little brush is quite nice though. The memory stick included comes with some test print models pre-loaded onto it, so I plugged it in at the front of the machine and then selected the right file. I poured the resin into the vat, making sure not to overfill it. A handy max fill level mark is printed on there to help you. All that was left to do, after popping the plastic cover back on, was to tap that print button, and the machine whirs into life. The build plate drops down into the resin, the light comes on and hardens the resin in the right places. Then the plate lifts up with the resin attached, drops back down and repeats the process. It will continue to do this until the model is finished. After a couple of hours the prints were complete, so using that plastic mount we saw earlier, I removed the build plate, popped it on the arm and then replaced the plate so that it is now at an angle and will allow all that precious resin to drip back into the vat. I then gave the parts a quick wash in water, having snapped them off the build plate. They were really stuck to the plate though, and I broke one of them in the process. Oh well, I guess that's why it's a test print. As mentioned on the bottle of resin, this water should not be poured down the drain as it's not particularly pleasant stuff, instead find another way to dispose of it. With the test models clean, they are still a bit soft and tacky to the touch. They need further exposure to UV light to really cure and go hard. Apparently, a couple of hours in direct sunlight will do it, but with the weather in the UK being less than agreeable, I needed an alternative solution. So, I simply lined a Tupperware box with some tinfoil and glued a string of UV LEDs to the inside. This simple curing box cost less than £15 to make, and after about 10 minutes these prints are completely cured. I'm pretty amazed with these two sample prints. They have good detail and you can make out the text on them. I thought it would be a good idea to try a few other things too though. About 10 years ago, I had designed a range of houses for a T-gauge model railway I was working on. That's 1 to 450 scale, so pretty small. And I thought that they would make a great test print too. And although they aren't perfect, they're not bad. There are some print lines and a few little places where the layers have split, but I'm sure with more experience I'd be able to get them looking really good. But for such small models and my first go, I'm pretty impressed. So, let's now try something a little more complicated. I did a bit of a search online to see if anyone had already designed a model plane, and came across this on Thingiverse. It's a Curtiss P1 Hawk in 1/72nd scale, and this looks like it might make a good first go at printing a model. So, I downloaded the files and imported them into Chitubox. This extra software will get the files ready to be printed. Sadly, they can't be printed straight away. I selected the right files and they appear on the build plate in the software. They don't fit, so at the time I thought I would reduce the scale by 50% to make a model which is pretty much 1 to 144th scale. I then added supports to the parts to make sure that they would print. This is not a tutorial on how to use this software and everything you need to do. There are some really good videos out there on those specific areas though. Basically, I just need to make sure that each layer that gets printed is supported. Otherwise, I'll just have random bits of resin floating around in the tank and the print will sadly fail. And with that done, I exported the file and saved it to the memory card, popped it into the printer and waited a few more hours. But, sadly, as you can see, it didn't go well. Some of the parts were just too small and didn't print well, whilst other parts are clearly not orientated well and the layers of resin have split. Lesson learned. I'll see if I can print it at the original scale and orientate the parts a bit better so that it actually works. And a few more hours later, yeah, I've got some 3D printed model parts. You can see here that the parts which are flat have got layer splits, whilst the ones orientated vertically have printed far better. Having cured these parts in my homemade UV box, they were then carefully cut away from the support material. Whilst there are some print lines visible, I am still pretty impressed with the quality of the print, and these were on just the most basic settings. The designer of this model has done quite a good job of getting detail on there too. Even some of the finer details have been printed to a high degree of accuracy. Anyways, long story short, I built this model, painted it, and added some decals, and this is what it looks like when I finished it. I am absolutely amazed that only a day or so ago this was just liquid resin. Now it's pretty accurate scale model. I'm looking at doing a full build video on this model in the future, but for now it's just outside the scope of this video. But yeah, I'm really blown away with how far 3D printing has come since I first experienced it a decade ago. So, what do I think of this printer? Well, on the whole, it's been a fairly positive experience. Whilst a completely new subject for me to cover, getting the printer set up and those first prints produced was not particularly difficult. The printer does have a little extractor fan built into it, with a filter, which is supposed to keep the smell of the resin down. And whilst I didn't notice a particularly strong smell with the resin I was using, it definitely did have a smell. And the fan, whilst I'm sure it helps, seemed to be more of a token effort. My advice would be to do your printing in a well-ventilated area so that you aren't breathing any of these fumes in. The rubber seal around the plastic lid did fall off a few times though, so it wasn't as tight as I would have liked it, perhaps a bit of glue might solve that problem. Whilst Elegoo have tried to make this as plug and play as possible, and yes, getting files on the machine to print is really easy, there were a few areas of the process that took some time to understand and research beforehand. Particularly getting the print setting right, orientating the models, adding supports in Chitobox, and then exporting the files. So, how much will this set you back? Well, at the time of making this review, the Mars 2 Pro printer was for sale on the Elegoo Amazon page for £270, featuring all the bits and pieces that I had here. There are other versions which are cheaper with different specifications. The bottle of resin I had was also about £20, but they do seem to have deals on occasionally, and it sometimes works out to be cheaper to buy a bigger bottle. And yes, I know what you're thinking, that's quite a lot of money to spend on one product. But if you can justify that initial spend, the prints themselves cost literally only about 20 pence to a couple of pounds in resin to print. But, as with anything in our hobby, there are many expensive things out there which we all like to use, like airbrushes, compressors, spray booths, and even the models themselves aren't particularly cheap sometimes. I guess it just depends on what your priorities are. Personally, I had actually considered getting a 3D printer quite a few times. I just never bit the bullet and made it happen. Perhaps it was the fear of starting something new that I might not necessarily understand. It would, though, have meant saving up for one, but it certainly wasn't outside my budget, especially with the quality of the prints I've seen from this printer today. So what do I think I'll use it for? Well, as you've seen, it's quite possible to make an entire scale model using it. I'm not sure it will replace those injection moulded kits that we all love to buy just yet. The areas I'm thinking this will come in super handy are for parts that are lost or damaged. If you could design and print a replacement, then it could solve problems for those kits you can't get spares for. Also, I think it would be handy for creating extra detailing parts, or scenic elements to bring out those dioramas, especially if something you want to replicate doesn't exist from the mainstream kit manufacturers. There is a growing community of designers out there, and there does seem to be quite a lot of things ready to be downloaded and printed straight away. I don't think that 3D printing is a threat to traditional modelling, but I certainly think that it should be embraced, because, if anything, I think it's probably here to stay. Seeing as it's changed so much in the last 10 years, I wonder what it will look like in the early 2030s. And with that, I think it's time to wrap this one up. I am incredibly impressed with this product. Whilst a completely new subject for me to cover, the Elegoo Mars 2 Pro does seem to be a fairly easy product to set up and get started with some printing. As with anything new, there is a bit of a learning curve, but with some time and mistakes made, I'm sure that in the future you may well see more 3D printed parts appearing in my videos. The resin isn't exactly the most pleasant of substances, and you must really take care when using it, taking heed of the warnings on the bottles, but if you're careful, it shouldn't really be a problem. And yes, whilst this may not be a particularly cheap product, in the grand scheme of things it's actually quite good value for money in my opinion. There are other 3D printers out there which are considerably more expensive, and I think that this one meets my needs for now. I think there's only one thing left to ask though, and that is, what should I print next? Let me know down in the comments, have you found this video helpful, and are you considering getting into some 3D printing yourself? Also, please tell me if you want to see a full build video on the 3D printed plane that I featured here. As always, shout out to my patrons and channel members for the amazing extra support they give my channel. Another thanks once again to Elegoo for sending this review sample out to me, and finally, another thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.